We've got with us an awesome guest speaker today. We always have awesome guest speakers, but the backstory on Dr. Thomas is that she is clinical director at an amazing inpatient rehab clinic facility in Slinger, Wisconsin, called The Manor. I got connected through to Dr. Thomas and The Manor through a fan board member, Steve Feldman, who said, "You got to meet these people. They're incredible." He opened the door for me with Dr. Thomas, and Dr. Thomas was our guest speaker 1 year ago. And how ironic is this, Chantel, that last year there was a snowstorm that prevented many of the people who wanted to come and hear you speak. I don't know what it was, 13, 14 inches of snow. We only had about 25 people show up, brave souls, who showed up. But here we are. It was 78 degrees today in Ann Arbor, Michigan. And so 1 year later, it's a little bit different from a weather perspective. But what I did was I reached out to Dr. Thomas, and I was ready to have Dr. Thomas replicate, present again on the same topic she talked about last year, which was unbelievably interesting and educational. It was about how to have conversations with your kids, your teenage children, about drugs and how to get ahead of that curve so that the dialogue is healthy and you kind of head things off at the pass. And Dr. Thomas did a great job, but then I thought, we're in the middle of this pandemic, and hey, Chantel, do you have anything at the ready that you could talk about that will help everyone deal with the stress that we're feeling? And she said, yes, I do. And how about this? And she sent me through Nancy, who works very closely with Dr. Thomas, a text message, and I think it's hitting the wall. And Chantel, why don't you tell everybody the title of your presentation?
So it's hitting the wall, how do sustained crises present opportunities for transformation?
And I said, bingo, let's do it. And the way I've been talking with everybody about this, the people that I've been trying to pull into this meeting, is by saying, we all know we know someone who's battling an addiction or who has battled a substance use disorder. But right now, we're all kind of feeling the same way because of COVID. And so I really wanted to do something that would benefit our entire community, not just people in recovery. And so we're really lucky to have Dr. Thomas as our guest speaker. And I think, Chantel, one of the reasons I think it feels to me like I've known you for so long, but I really haven't. I've known you for about a year, is because you remind me of a dear friend of mine who is also a therapist, a master's degree psychotherapist. And I love that woman. And so you remind me a lot of her. Oh. And so with that, I want to turn it over to Dr. Chantel Thomas. And again, as you have questions, fire them away in the chat feature, and we'll figure out how we're going to get everybody involved. Okay. So Dr. Thomas, do your thing.
Awesome. Thank you so much, Steve. Steve knows this, that I am very sad to not, well, I'm sure everybody's sad for us to not be in person, but in particular, I relish any opportunity to go to Michigan for multiple reasons, but particularly because I am a huge fan of Zingerman's. So that is a little depressing. Very
So,
small loss, but
so let me interject. Dr. Thomas is also not only a Zingerman's fan, but she is a Zingerman's pastrami fan.
that's right.
So I hope she's got a love package coming from Zingerman's tomorrow to Slinger, Wisconsin. That's going to feed 8 to 10 of your best buddies Zingerman's pastrami sandwiches. So I
And by be-
digress.
and by best buddies, he means me, myself, and maybe my husband are going to be fed with these pastrami sandwiches.
All right.
Yeah, so I'm super happy to be with you all tonight. It's an honor to be invited back to talk to you all. I had such a great time, and I saw a small window of the love, the passion, and the devotion that the members of this community have when I actually thought I was going to speak to a room of no one in the middle of a whiteout, and there was actually a crowd of people who drove through the snow to be there. So it's lovely to be back here today. This talk really came about for me. I would say it was about 4 months into the break of COVID. Um, and the impetus behind it was really so I am a clinical director of a substance abuse treatment facility, and we're not owned by a big corporation. We're owned by, it's a family business. Um, and I remember when COVID first hit, just noticing what was happening in my own body, the amount of adrenaline I was feeling, the amount of anxiety I was feeling, the amount of uncertainty I was feeling, and having this really deep sense of responsibility to keep the program running, knowing that we're treating a life and death condition up against another condition that was potentially life or death for people. And how do we navigate this in a way that doesn't create barriers for people who clearly need to access treatment? But I do remember those first initial weeks, just had this constant kind of pounding anxiety and this fear of what's happening, what's going on, like when is the finish line, all of this uncertainty. And I remember um, looking around me in our treatment center and looking at my staff 2 weeks in, 3 weeks in, 4 weeks in, 6 weeks in, and everybody looked like they were on pins and needles. And then I remember looking at the clients, and the clients looked great. The clients were totally fine. Like, and I sat there reflecting on this, trying to understand, like, why are the people who are in the middle of their most vulnerable time, why don't they look more panicked and concerned about this, like the rest of us staff members do? And I realized I was driving to work. Actually, I know exactly where I was on my drive. I have a bit of a commute. Um, and I was repeating to myself in my head, like, what are we going to do? Like, how are we going to get through this? And when is the finish line? And what are we going to do to get through this? And this just feels so uncomfortable. And I don't know how to make this better. And I don't know how to take care of my therapists, and just tons of panic and uncertainty. And it occurred to me um, for the first time through the whole experience, you know, I say to my clients every single day, um, when you are going through discomfort, and when you're going through fear, and when you're going through uncertainty, that is an opportunity for growth. Like, that is where the real healing begins, is when you put yourself out of your comfort zone and you believe the disruption of you, your life, your relationships, the things that you rely on for comfort, when those things get kind of turned upside down and disrupted, that is really the opportunity for growth. I mean, essentially, everything that we're doing in treatment is coaching people through what they would describe as the darkest time in their life, with tremendous fear that nothing is going to be okay. And I thought, well, this is a really interesting opportunity for me to really test whether or not I believe what I'm telling my clients. Not only is it an interesting opportunity for me, but this other interesting piece, we have a staff that is really talented and wonderful. About I would say a third to a half, depending on which part of the staff you're talking about, are in recovery, and then the other half are not. And I turned to my staff and I said, look, if you've never struggled with an addiction yourself, this is the moment for you to tap in, because we are all living the experience of someone in recovery right now in the very early stages when they have no idea what the future is going to hold, when there's constant uncertainty, when they can't see the other side of the mountain. And so that was really the impetus for this talk. I'm going to share the presentation with you now. But that's really why it started. Let me pull it over here and we'll get things started. So part of this was really about, do we believe that it's possible for us to grow through periods of tremendous discomfort? And I'm going to see, Brandon, let's see how I get me to start here. Oh, I think it's a little pulpit.
Slideshow. It says slideshow, and then you can
God bless you. Mine.
Down, and then it's.
Oh, I see it. I see it. Got it.
And then
there we go. Play from the start.
Yep.
There we go, friends. All right. So what I'm essentially proposing is that our current landscape presents a profound opportunity to more deeply understand and live inside the struggle of the recovery journey for those who are struggling in general, not just people who are in recovery. So just to give you an overview, what I'm going to do is talk about how this process connects with a concept in therapy called a parallel process. I'm going to talk just briefly about the stages of recovery and the ones that we highlight particularly in treatment. And then we're going to talk about our current experience of our recovery as it's impacted by the current circumstances that are happening around us, the opportunities for learning, exploring what your resources are in the face of this. And then I'm going to touch on the concept of post-traumatic growth and the concept of resilience. So just to start off with, the concept of parallel process, and this is why it was particularly interesting, and this is how I first brought it to my staff. Parallel process is essentially when you're working with a client as a therapist and you're having a struggle in that relationship, you're trying to figure out what's going on. There's something happening in that dynamic. And then you go to another supervisor and you talk about the experience that you're having struggling with the client. And the same dynamic shows up with the supervisor that you're trying to get help from. Another way to think about that is like the concepts of transference and countertransference, which is basically when you find yourself having a personal reaction to the person that you're working with that feels particularly charged emotionally, and you're not really sure what to make of it. Maybe you really like your therapist, or maybe you really don't like them. And then you all of a sudden realize, you know who they remind me of? My Aunt Linda. And my Aunt Linda was so judgmental of me. I never liked being around her. So your personal experience is having an impact on your ability to make a therapeutic connection with the person that you're working with. Well, this can also happen for therapists who are working with clients. Let's say you as a therapist are going through a divorce and you're working with a client who's also going through a divorce. It's kind of impossible not for you to have your own personal issues start to infiltrate some of the way in which you're able to support the person that you're working with. And so this became a really interesting way to look at, okay, so we as therapists are here to support our clients. We're here to give them the opportunity to heal, to feel safe. How do we do that in an environment where we don't necessarily feel safe, where there's tons of uncertainty and tons of fear that we're living with outside of this treatment center and even inside of the treatment center? And so what we talked about was, while that definitely creates an added strain for the mental health community, and it's actually one of my biggest concerns long term, is kind of the toll that mental health providers will take as a result of COVID, because they're essentially living the experience of someone talking through these struggles 8 hours a day. And that's kind of a different kind of load or a level of trauma. So how do we navigate that um, in a way that allows us to feel more connected to the person that we're working with, as opposed to feeling this sense of pressure to essentially appear as though nothing is happening, which isn't a very genuine or an authentic process. So, what I'm going to do today is talk about the very early stages of COVID, which may be hard for some of you to reflect back on, and then kind of parallel that to the recovery journey itself. So, in the very beginning of the recovery journey, for some people, they have this experience that we call proverbially the pink cloud. And it's like the early stage of substance abuse recovery that involves feelings of euphoria, elation. You'll hear people talk in the meetings about you're on a pink cloud. You sometimes see it happen in treatment where people have this tremendous optimism about what's possible and this excitement. Um, but oftentimes, why it feels particularly unsustainable is the idea that that optimism is often disconnected from the effort that's going to be required in order to really significantly shift things. And so, while there's lots of relief and maybe some lightness, and even some euphoria, ultimately people get to the point where they call what we hit the wall in treatment. So that would be a point for in a residential treatment environment. I would say that usually happens for a lot of our clients around week 3. Um, they might be on a pink cloud for the first week of the recovery process, maybe even the first 2 weeks. They're feeling really good. All of a sudden, they start realizing what's in front of them and the long term process that is to come to get to the other side of it, and the awareness of the continued daily efforts feels like a greater burden than actually just going out and using again. And this is a really critical part of the recovery process, because this is where many people peel out of recovery and go back to use because they finally come front and center, maybe with a lot of the things they've been avoiding for a really long time. Maybe they start to come into recognition of how difficult this path is going to be, how much conflict they might have to navigate. They're faced with a lot of the unknown, and they're recognizing where their skill set may be behind what their capacity is to deal with those struggles. And so a lot of people start fantasizing about using as a way to escape and as a way to remove themselves from those type of situations. Okay. Now, if we think about the very beginning of the COVID process, again, I asked you to reflect back because we've been in this for such a long time. But I remember when it first occurred, although I had a tremendous amount of anxiety, I remember talking to a number of friends of mine who didn't feel responsible necessarily for a lot of other people. They weren't necessarily running a program. There was a little bit more of a sense of collectivism. There was a break in monotony for a lot of people. So a lot of my friends were working from home. There was a disruption in the work routine, and they actually, several people that I knew said, "Oh, this has actually been a nice time for me to spend more time with my family. I'm slowing down in my life." Um, and then what I would call like silver lining opportunities that came as a result of COVID were this opportunity for heightening awareness around social and racial injustice. You really have to wonder if where we would be in terms of our collective awareness would have actually happened without the kind of pressure cooker situation that I think COVID created for a lot of people. Um, and so what happens as a result of that is, again, an opportunity to expose for a lot of people, who didn't have the comfort of their routines, and didn't have their work to throw themselves into or their distractions to throw themselves into. People started becoming more aware of maybe where there were blind spots. Um, for many people who had troubling relationships, those things got heightened in the sense of being together, and not having outlets for escape in the same way. Um, and so, what I want to just talk about, I observed to be a really interesting piece of the beginning of COVID and then the early recovery journey for people. Um, what a lot of people were talking about is the fact that they felt really disconnected from one another and incredibly isolated. Um, what was very interesting for me to note is that society at large appeared to have done a lot of the grieving that they initially experienced in COVID through their ability to essentially use alcohol. I mean, I remember watching a number of people around me. There were work related happy hours that were happening, or many colleagues at the university that I knew, just the amount of drinking that was going on at home for people started to escalate. And this became a really interesting thing because the recovery community itself went through this massive isolation process, and in some ways someone who's struggling with the recovery process and addictive process in general already feels incredibly isolated from a lot of other people. They can't participate in social gatherings in the same way without alcohol or substances being part of the equation. And so you kind of watched what the collective experience looked like for people who didn't have access to the things they normally would have for fun or for relief. And one of the coping mechanisms that most people used in a lot of circumstances was to escalate their substance use. So then this is where this is amazing opportunity for compassion for someone who's going through the recovery journey. They essentially have learned that a lot of the outlets that they can't have as outlets have disappeared. There's a deep sense of isolation. They have to let go of a lot of the friendship connections that they already have. And now they don't have this opportunity to escape the same way that many people were drawn to escaping through the COVID process. And they didn't have these opportunities to essentially check out in the same way that other people did. And what often happens in the recovery community, I think there's sometimes a lack of compassion for the extent to which normal people rely on substances as a way to check out, as a way to give themselves relief, as their way to have fun. And if you acknowledge that as a part of a substance abuse community, you're told that you're glorifying, you're told that you're awfulizing sobriety. There's a question where the time's really that good. There's this idea you just need to go to a meeting. But what we're asking people to do in the recovery journey is be emotionally sober all the time, not have these outlets for tolerating the uncertainty, not in the same way that they're reliant upon substances. That's not to say that they can't develop them in different ways, but let's be honest, when you look around you watching other people in our society, how did they deal with the fear and uncertainty that came with that isolation? A lot of people chose to drink or use substances. So this really, in my, from our lens, we saw this as a real opportunity for individuals to really have a deeper level of compassion for what someone has to go through and experience when they already feel isolated out of society and they don't have access to the same opportunities. So one of the other things that I wanted to kind of highlight and ask people to reflect on, because there's been various stages in this process. I am not in any way, the scope of this presentation really doesn't speak to the tremendous economic disparities that existed in the way in which the divide between people who have resources and don't have resources, the vulnerable population, sadly, in many circumstances, people of color, those divides just got so much bigger with COVID for multiple reasons. When there's a crisis, it actually creates greater strain level for the people who are most vulnerable. But for individuals who were fortunate enough to keep their jobs, it doesn't mean that they also did not go through their own struggles. And what I find super interesting is each person individually on this call will probably say different things about what sort of a wall they feel like they've experienced in as a result of what has happened over the last several months. Is it the sense of isolation? Is it really missing family? Is it just being tired of wearing a mask, if that's part of your experience? Is it just the constant fear of when will this end? When are we going to get to the other side of this? Is it the fact that because there's just this extra layer of stress and strain for everyone, are you more irritable? Are you shorter in relationships? Do you find yourself getting in fights more often? Do you find yourself more edgy, more irritable? Is it that you never really identified with a faith to begin with? Maybe you don't believe in God. Maybe you don't take any sort of spiritual solace in moments like this. Is it the fact that there is massive financial strain on top of what is already existing challenges that might be affecting where you live, what your housing is? For some people, the inability to travel had a big impact on their jobs, but it also just had a big impact on how they resource themselves. And then this loss of comfort and distraction and avoidance that comes from being able to go to the restaurant that you like or being able to go visit the family that you have. And then the last piece that I'll talk about is the fact that there's homeschooling, which is been a massive issue for so many families. And this concept that you can work from home and also homeschool your child again, is just, quite frankly, an untenable situation for a lot of people in a lot of circumstances. So, what have we learned about the last 9 months? How do we, I'm painting a picture that's pretty grim for a lot of people. How do we view this crisis that has happened to our country, the kind of awakening that has happened as a result? Maybe many people have questioned kind of what the greater sense of humanity is in our culture, in our country right now. How do we view this crisis as a disruptor? Um, Recovery language has often honored the concept that real transformation is often birthed from really powerful disruption. What do they talk about in recovery communities? The idea of hitting a bottom is one of your breakthrough opportunities to something much greater. And how could this crisis or a crisis of faith in general evoke a spiritual opportunity or an opportunity to deepen your meaning and your sense of purpose? What have you truly learned about your relationships with other people, the relationship you have with yourself in the last 9 months? And how does this opportunity that we've all been experiencing help ground us in a much deeper awareness of what it means to be truly isolated, to live with a constant sense of fear and uncertainty, to not have the reassurance that things will just be fine at some point in time down the road because we can't see exactly what that marker is? How do we hold on to all of these different challenges as opportunities for growth under these circumstances? I kind of love this picture. Um, I have this little girl. I have two daughters, so I could definitely see one of them doing this. One of them might have pushed the other one right over the other edge of the wall. But so, what can we do to help someone climb that wall that they're hitting? Where are the places that we need to look? What can you learn about yourself that is going to help you through this process? Um, Maybe it's deepening your sense of your own spirituality. Maybe it's really re examining what connection looks like for you. Maybe it's identifying those things in your life that give you a sense of hope. Maybe it's recognizing that this time of crisis and this kind of being gilded in this way, people often say that difficult times reveal people's character. What is this time revealed about your character? What is it revealed about who you are and your inner core? How do you tap into the essence of who you are when you don't have access to all the things that you normally do? How does this provide opportunities for courage and deepening insight? Maybe there's an opportunity to implement a different kind of routine around your survival in order to make sure that you are taking care of yourself. For some people, exercise became a thing. There was a good swath of the population that increased their alcohol use, but there's also a big part of the population that decided to pull back on their alcohol use and use this as a time to get in better shape. Um, and how do these crises present an opportunity for you to tap into your vulnerability? And what does it mean for you to talk about the concept of surrendering? What does it mean to talk about the concept of being accountable to the people around you when you are maybe you short-tempered with them? I've had to apologize to my coworkers more times in the last 6 months than I have in the last year. I know that I am more stressed out. I know that I don't have as much patience at time. How does this really help you flex the muscle of accountability? Now, if we're looking at, what are the things that help you sustain your recovery as a person in sobriety, all of these things would be on that list as well, right? So here's where I want to just talk a little bit about the concept of post-traumatic growth. So this actually comes out of the work of University of North Carolina at Charlotte. And it's the idea that when you go through a traumatic event, and I think the last 9 months would definitely qualify as traumatic for a number of different reasons for people. It's the psychological transformation that follows a stressful encounter. It's a way of finding purpose in the pain and looking beyond that struggle. And so, where do opportunities for post traumatic growth occur? Um, in 5 general areas, according to the research that comes out of this university. It's the idea that new opportunities emerge for you that were not present before because you're in this struggle. And this really hits home for me, because I can't tell you how many times I've said to the folks in our treatment center, if you can choose the path of sobriety, if you commit yourself to growing in this way, you essentially become better people. Like, it's not just someone who doesn't drink and use, it's a more evolved way to operate, to be in emotional sobriety, to be in accountability, to actually have a deep and rigorous look at your life, your ability to be accountable to other people. You just become better human beings. And that's why I love surrounding myself by people who are on the recovery journey, who actually work a program, because there is this deep level of accountability that not that many other people are required to do for their survival. But that's a post-traumatic growth opportunity. There is also this opportunity for changing the depth of your relationships with others. How does a crisis allow you to increase the closeness that you have in certain relationship and increase your sense of connection with others who are suffering? Maybe it was impossible for you to relate or understand something about someone who was struggling, because you just felt like you hadn't had experiences like that in your life. But where I think we all have kind of been leveled and equalized to some extent in some ways by this experience is just having a lot more compassion for people who are suffering. There's this opportunity for an increased sense of your own strength, to recognize that, if we can live through this, there's a sense of resiliency that comes through this, any time of adversity or any time of challenge, a greater appreciation for life in general, as we know many people's lives have been lost over the last 9 months. And potentially there's a possibility for deepening spiritual lives for individuals and their sense of meaning and purpose. And that deepening can also involve maybe a change in one's belief system. Perhaps you are not necessarily identifying as a spiritual person, but these last 9 months have made you really rethink what it means to have a purpose beyond here and a sense of connection to something greater than yourself. Um, and so I'll touch a little bit more on other post-traumatic growth opportunities that I see have emerged through this. What are these moments telling us about ourselves over the last 9 months? What do they reveal about our sense of shame, our sense of guilt, maybe versus our sense of shame? And how I would differentiate that is, guilt is I did something bad, versus shame, I am bad. Um, for many people, it's a numbers game, and it's being in the wrong time in the wrong place where people were infected potentially, or many people lived in communities where it was impossible to isolate from other people. They didn't have access to testing, they didn't have access to PPE, they didn't have access to the resources that helped keep other people safe. How do you kind of live with that experience when you see that disparity happening? What do you do with that sense of, maybe, is it a sense of guilt? Is it a sense of shame for some people? These two concepts are a critical differentiating factor for people in the recovery journey, because my experience has been that when people actually have deep-seated feelings of shame about themselves, they're far more prone to relapse. And what does a time like this potentially reveal about our shadow? We've seen a lot of things happen over the last 9 months, and some of them have been very dark. Carl Jung was basically a philosopher who came up with the concept of shadow. And so that's the idea that I'm going to read a quote from him. Unfortunately, there can be no doubt that man is, on the whole, less good than he imagines himself or wants to be. Everyone carries a shadow, and the less it is embodied in the individual's conscious life, the blacker and denser it is. If an inferiority is conscious, one always has the chance to correct it. Furthermore, it is constantly in contact with other interests, so it is continually subjected to modifications. But if it is repressed and isolated from consciousness, it never gets corrected. So this is the idea of coming in touch with some of the darker impulses that you have. We call that shadow work. And the idea is by admitting and acknowledging that exists in every part of humanity, it actually allows us to bring it into the light. This is a critical stage of the recovery journey. Essentially, the 12-step program is hinged around the concept of talking about the dark things that had happened to you in your recovery and your addiction process. I bring this up because we've seen a ton of unrest that's happened over the last 9 months. We've seen a lot of behavior of violence and brutality. We've seen some pretty dark things emerge in the face of this situation. And so, what do we do with that information? Do we just say, oh, there's just bad people in the world? Or do we really look at a deeper examination of what everybody potentially has inside of them? And what is our sense of responsibility to do with that, right? So, we can have behaviors and actions that are very dark. Does that make you at your core an evil person, or does it allow you to have a deeper sense of appreciation for the complexity of what it means to be a human being? And in the same way, does that allow you to have more compassion for some of the behaviors that emanate from people who are in addictive process? Like I mentioned before, do we really believe what we're telling our clients? If we're mental health professionals, if we're even parents who've said, you know, it's difficult when things seem really dark and uncertain, you've got to just persevere. Do you personally allow yourself to believe it when you're in the middle of something that's really uncomfortable? And how does this time over the last 9 months allow you to connect more deeply with your sense of who you are as a person? And I mention the nervous system here because that's the sensations that happen in your body on a daily basis. What you notice about your heart, what you notice about your pulse, your breath, the sweatiness of your palm, the tension in your muscles, all of those bodily sensations are giving you cues about whether or not your body actually feels safe. And if you are noticing that you're feeling a constant sense of tension and arousal, what is your commitment to doing something about it? How are you going to tune into your body and make a commitment to do something differently? This is an interesting choice and an opportunity because this is what people are navigating all the time in the early stages of recovery journey. When they come off of a substance, they feel tense, they feel anxious, they feel unsafe, they feel hypervigilant, and they have all the same cascade of unsafety, right? And they can logically say, well, I'm probably going to be okay, but in their body, they can feel that tension all the time. Maybe you've had experiences over the last 9 months that have helped you get a deeper sense of what that tension feels like. And so, what's your call of duty around that? I'm going to end on what I believe is a high note, which is the concept of resiliency as a potential byproduct from crises. What is resilience? It's the process of adapting well in the face of adversity, trauma, tragedy, threats, or even significant sources of stress. And how does it serve us? When we've been the victim of circumstances that have, victim is a charged word. We talk about it a lot in our treatment center. When you have survived a crisis, how do you allow yourself to evolve into a survivor as opposed to staying in the stance of a victim? How do we find this sense of resiliency? Well, many people who've studied this, and there's resiliency scales that come from a number of different universities. What four of the concepts that have really driven home the differentiator between whether or not people stay in a place of victimhood versus people moving into a place of resilience is their sense of connection to others, their sense of personal wellness. Can they make meaning from what has happened? What is the story they tell themselves? That's attribution. What do you tell yourself about what's happened and what it means for you moving forward? And some of the questions that I would like to pose, and I like to pose in our treatment center, is what is resiliency's relationship to vulnerability? And what is the relationship of resilience to compassion? Brene Brown is a researcher who studies a lot about shame and vulnerability, and she speaks about the concept of vulnerability as an equation: uncertainty plus risk plus emotional exposure. Well, how many people have been experiencing uncertainty, risk, and emotional exposure over the last 9 months? A lot. The question is whether or not you embrace it and you talk about it with each other, or do we just stop learning to talk about it? And what happens when we're all going through a collective experience of trauma? We stop talking about it, we lose our sense of connection. So it's really moving into vulnerability and having conversations where you emotionally expose yourself that promotes deeper capacity for connection. It provides a potential antidote for a sense of isolation at the same time. I am going to read you one last poem because I love this poet. And his name is David White. And however you need to receive poetry, if you need to close your eyes or whatever it is, for me, I always let poetry wash over me. And the first feeling I have is the thing that matters. So not putting pressure on yourself to understand every part of it. what I love about David White is he talks about this concept of how opportunities present you with questions and how sometimes those questions are a powerful inroad to growth and discovery. So I'll read it aloud for you now. Sometimes, if you move carefully through the forest, breathing like the ones in the old stories who could cross a shimmering bed of leaves without a sound, you come to a place whose only task is to trouble you with tiny but frightening requests, conceived out of nowhere, but in this place beginning to lead everywhere. Requests to stop what you are doing right now and to stop what you are becoming while you do it. Questions that can make or unmake a life. Questions that have patiently waited for you. Questions that have no right to go away. And those, my friends, are the references from my talk.